Okay. Hi, welcome to the 1 o'clock session of Let's Make a Scene. I'm Curtis Peoples. I'm going to be your chair for today. Got a great panel. I was looking at this panel in the when we were doing all of the planning. I was like, I can't wait to go to that session. Now I get to chair the session. How about that? So Let's Make a Scene reminds me of David Byrne's book on how to make a scene. There's a great chapter in there on making scenes in clubs and towns and stuff like that. So this is a little bit different, but it reminded me of that. First up today, we're going to have Carrie Jenelle, who's serving as the current president of ARSC, having been a member since 2002. He's also completed a term of ARSC second vice president and program chair for its conferences in Chapel Hill and Pittsburgh. Carrie has published 10 books on American music and is a 6-time winner of the ARSC Award for Excellence in Historical Recorded Sound Research. He's just completed work on the 9th edition of Broadway musicals Show by Show, published by Applause Books. In 2001, he received a Grammy nomination for compiling and annotating Washington Square Memoirs, The Great Urban Folk Boom, a CD compilation produced by Rhino Records. Carrie has been interested in folk music ever since the age of 6, when he watched Harry Belafonte perform Jimmy Rogers' Mule Skinner Blues on The Ed Sullivan Show. Many thousands of records later, he is now exploring the roots of the folk music revival, resulting in his talk, Concertizing Folk Music, The Roots of the Folk Music Revival. Carrie.
Thank you. The urban folk music revival refers to a period when traditional American folk music was performed and recorded by artists who did not learn songs from oral tradition, but rather from printed or previously recorded materials. The so-called revival was triggered by the success of the Weavers in the early 1950s, but goes back a decade prior to that in this nondescript building in Greenwich Village. This was Almanac House, where singers like Pete Seeger, Lee Hayes, Woody Guthrie, and others worked to promote labor unions and progressive politics through their adaptations of folk songs as the Almanac Singers. The roots of the folk music revival go back further, long before the almanacs began singing of union maids and solidarity forever. In the first decades of the 20th century, folk and hillbilly music were interchangeable terms. American music handed down from generation to generation through oral tradition, with no written transcriptions or recordings of the ballads, lullabies, dance tunes, work songs, and sea shanties sung by average Americans as part of their everyday lives. After folklorists started documenting folk songs, the music no longer belonged solely to the folk, but to scholars, students, and those interested in the history of American culture. It was only then that performers and some folklorists began presenting folk music in concert settings outside of the area where those songs were collected. These concerts brought folk music's traditional repertoire to audiences who might never have heard it otherwise, including those who would spearhead the folk music revival of the 40s and 50s. The concertizing of folk music took place chiefly in New York City. Hallmarks of these new contextual settings helped separate folk from hillbilly music. For example, the songs were presented as antiquities, survivals of past cultures that were deemed backward or primitive by so-called sophisticated audiences. The performers who demonstrated the songs were often formally trained, although efforts were made to present some authentic performers, in quotes, from rural regions, sometimes in demeaning ways. Many of the songs were not learned through oral tradition, but from published folk song collections, which helped determine the repertoire of future folk singers. Thus, the songs were taken out of their natural contexts and sung in New York concert halls and swanky nightclubs, not through their original functions in rural society, but as lectures or demonstrations. The expansion of folk music's reach began with the publication of the English and Scottish popular ballads by Francis James Child, first published in 1882, consisting of the texts of some 305 traditional ballads from England and Scotland and their American variants, which became known as the Child Ballads. American folklorists soon began conducting their own fieldwork, collecting songs like so many pieces of ripe fruit that had fallen from trees. In 1908, New Mexico writer Nathan Howard Thorpe, who became known as Cowboy Jack, published a collection of cowboy songs that he had been accumulating in the Southwest since 1889, the first such collection of American folk music, which included such songs as The Streets of Laredo, derived from an Irish folk tune, and Little Joe the Wrangler. 2 years later, Texas teacher and musicologist John Lomax published the first of his many books on American folk music. Works such as those by Lomax and Thorpe helped document the lyrics of traditional American folk songs, establishing a printed repertoire that would be used by countless performers in years to come. It was around this time that professionals first began performing these songs in concert settings in New York City. One of the earliest was in 1908, when one Thomas Tryon presented a musicale consisting of selections by American composers, including cowboy ballads, Negro folk songs, and Spanish music from California. The divide between folk and hillbilly music would eventually become more pronounced. Hillbilly, a pejorative term, came to mean music performed by rural artists for their peers, while folk music would develop a loftier connotation, performed by sophisticated interpreters in formalized settings, such as in this gathering by members of the National Arts Club. According to musicologist Henry Kraybiel, who for 43 years served as the music critic for the New York Tribune, a, quote, true folk song grew up among the peoples of the world as a spontaneous utterance without the influence of conscious art, unquote. Kraybiel wrote the notes to a 1910 recital by one Marcella Sembridge, who performed a selection of folk songs that were distinguished from songs like Stephen Foster's Old Folks at Home, which had been commercially composed and published for profit. Many early recordings of folk songs exist, much of it from minstrelsy, but also spirituals by groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the first group to tour presenting folk-oriented material. Randy Jones covered that part of folk music's history in a talk earlier today, so I will not duplicate her summation of this aspect of the dissemination of African-American folk music. But as far as early performers who also performed concerts of rural folk music, we can start in 1919, when the first recording of a cowboy song was made by a former law student from Virginia's Piedmont region named Bentley Ball. Ball worked for a typewriter company, and in addition to conducting demonstrations of speed typing, he also presented concerts of cowboy songs that he had learned from John Lomax's anthology. Ball's stiff, formal performance, complete with piano accompaniment utilizing dramatically rolled R's, cannot be considered authentic by any means of the imagination, but nevertheless, Ball was the first artist to make recordings of cowboy tunes, such as the Ballad of Jesse James. The label included the legend American Folk Song, giving the material a patina of authenticity.
Jesse James was the lad that killed many a man here off the Danville train. But the mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. Poor Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life, 3 children, they were brave. But this mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave.
Despite their insistence on authentic representations of folk music, record companies initially resisted recording the voices of rural-based singers. Smoky Mountain guitarist harmonica specialist George Renaud was one of those who, like hillbilly music pioneer Fiddlin' John Carson, had a rough-sounding voice. So the folks at Vocalion Records decided to substitute an uncredited vocal by smooth-singing vaudevillian Gene Austin on this 1924 version of Casey Jones. It is noted that Edison did not adhere to this practice, crediting both Austin and Renaud on its labels as the Blue Ridge Duo. Unsuspecting listeners who bought the Vocalion records, however, never knew the difference, but they could have figured it out had they considered the fact that Renaud would have had to have been the first singer in history to sing and play the harmonica at the same time.
Come on, your honors, if you want to hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was around his name on the 6-8-wheeler, boys who won his name. The caller called Casey at 4:30, kissed his wife at the station door, mounted to the cabin with his orders in his hand, took a farewell trip to the promised land. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin, Casey Jones with his orders in his hand. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin, took a farewell trip to the promised land.
On radio, smooth-singing Bradley Kincaid sang folk songs to urban audiences, listening to live broadcasts of WLS Chicago's National Barn Dance program, while North Carolina lawyer Bascom Lamar Lunsford gave lectures and sang traditional songs and played banjo while formally attired in a black tuxedo. In the 1920s and 30s, there were two additional highly influential song collections that came to light, each featuring written music along with lyrics and contextual histories of folk songs. Poet-historian Carl Sandburg not only popularized folk music through his 1927 publication, The American Songbag, but took up the guitar to perform the songs he had collected, delivered in a dry, authentic-sounding drawl.
Boll weevil lamb, a little black buck, come from Mexico, they say. Come all the way to Texas, looking for a place to stay, just looking for a home, just looking for a home. The first time I seen the boll weevil, he was a-settin' on the square. The next time I seen the boll weevil, he had all of his family there, just looking for a home, just looking for a home.
The songs in the American Songbag were neatly categorized by subject matter, dealing with everything from regionally relevant material to songs listed according to occupation, making a handy reference tool for aspiring folk singers in later years. The other major work published at this time was English Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians, published in 1932 by English music teacher Cecil Sharp, who gave well-regarded lectures on how folk ballads from the British Isles made the transition to the hills and valleys of Appalachia. In the late 1920s, Jean Bell Thomas, a stenographer from Ashland, Kentucky, came to be known as the Traipsin' Woman due to her frequent travels from courthouse to courthouse by jolt wagon through the mountains of eastern Kentucky. In the process, she learned about the folkways of the Kentucky people and collected folk songs rooted in the British Isles. In 1926, she discovered a blind fiddler from Ashland named J.W. Day, who was surviving as a beggar by playing a mixture of traditional fiddle tunes and his own topical compositions. Using her skills as a press agent for notorious speakeasy hostess Texas Gyein, Thomas invented the pseudonym Gilson Setters for Day and began booking him in theaters as the singing fiddler from Lost Hope Hollow. In September 1930, Jean Thomas started the American Folk Song Festival, an annual event held near Ashland, Kentucky, that she hosted until 1972. Gilson Setters was one of its early featured performers, and Thomas published a story on Setters in American Magazine, describing how he was a modern survival of the ancient Elizabethan minstrel. Thomas eventually expanded the article into a fictionalized biography, published in 1938, focusing on Setters' life in the non-existent hamlet of Lost Hope Hollow. Mark Twain would have been delighted as Thomas pulled the wool over her audience's eyes through her calculated deception, complete with concocted dialogue in the vernacular of Appalachian hill folk. In 1931, she even took Setters to London, where he performed in the Royal Albert Hall at a folk song festival. Setters was praised by English critics as being a classic example, a traditional folk singer of Elizabethan ballads, despite the fact that many of his songs were of his own creation. The pretense of fabricating quaint stories about this ordinary Kentucky beggar was nothing but a ruse worthy of a traveling carnival, a human musical theme park with Thomas as a purveyor of fake lore, taking advantage of the public's voracious appetite for anything authentic. In 1928, Thomas even got Setters into the Victor Studios to record 10 sides of old-time fiddle music, accompanied by professional session man Carson Robison on guitar. Setters would also record for John Lomax and the Library of Congress in the 1930s.
I tune up my fiddle, I loosen my bow, I make myself up on my left and I go. Lordy, I'll sleepy I feel. Lordy, I'll sleepy I feel.
the photograph of Setters is not reversed. He was a lefty. Gene Thomas's American Folk Song Festival featured appearances by another Kentucky native, Aunt Molly Jackson, who demonstrated her repertoire of songs from the mountains of Kentucky to audiences at NYU and other formal settings. But unlike Gilson Setters, there was nothing fabricated about Aunt Molly's hard-scrabble life. The daughter and wife of Kentucky coal miners, Jackson was a union activist promoting coal miners' causes. In 1931, she testified before the Dreiser Committee, which was investigating union organizers' fights against coal companies and local law enforcement officials, singing her own composition, Ragged Hungry Blues.
Friends and comrades, I've had some very interesting letters from Kentucky this morning, and I have so much on my mind I hardly know how to address you. And I will endeavor to sing to you my hungry, wearied blues that I composed when I was down there suffering with those people. And now wait until I can strike a note, a chord. I'm sad and weary. I've got the hungry, ragged blues. I'm sad and weary. I've got the hungry, ragged blues. Not a penny in the pocket to buy one thing I need to you.
Composer David Gyein worked a fascination with traditional cowboy songs into a career as a writer of ragtime tunes and arranger of the traditional folk tunes he listened to while growing up on a ranch in Ballinger, Texas. In 1919, he crafted a challenging arrangement of the minstrel tune Old Zip Coon, known to fiddlers as Turkey in the Straw, which he would perform in concert settings. Musical America magazine sang Gyein's praises, saying, quote, "What Percy Grainger has done for some British and Irish folk tunes, Gyein has done for songs of the American cowboy and the old fiddlers break down Turkey in the Straw." David Gyein is one of the cleverest composers in America today. In 1929, Gyein wrote and starred in a stage show titled Prairie Echoes, which played at Broadway's Roxy Theater, singing some of his arrangements of cowboy songs. One of these numbers that he arranged was the cowboy song Home on the Range, which Gyein first worked on in 1908 when he was 15. When Gyein published his arrangement, it became the accepted version of the song and a popular standard, easily sung and instantly recognizable, popularized in a famous 1931 Victrola recording by operatic baritone John Charles Thomas.
Where the graceful white swan goes gliding along like a maid in a heavenly dream, then I wouldn't exchange my home on the range where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.
And if anybody has fallen in love with this song just by hearing that little snippet, I found a copy of it on the original Scroll Victor down the street. It's on the silent auction table, so bid away. The success of Home on the Range inspired George Gershwin to write pseudo-cowboy songs for Broadway, like Bidin' My Time, while Cole Porter penned Don't Fence Me In. New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt pronounced Home on the Range as his favorite song, leading to a series of radio programs on which David Gyein and an orchestra performed some of his other adaptations of traditional folk songs. John Charles Thomas soon developed his own stage show, singing Home on the Range as well as other cowboy songs and Negro spirituals before rapturous audiences at New York's Town Hall. As for Gyein, in 1931, he contributed arrangements of cowboy songs to playwright Lynn Riggs' new Broadway play about farmers and ranchers living in territorial Oklahoma. Green Grow the Lilacs starred Franchot Tone as cowpoke Curly McLean, and featured a young Broadway actor from East Texas named Tex Ritter, who sang Gyeon's arrangements of cowboy songs. In 1943, the show was turned into the legendary musical Oklahoma, with the show's cowboy songs jettisoned in place of a score written by the newly anointed Broadway team of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. In the 1920s, musician and song collector John Jacob Niles became one of the first to recognize the potential of song publishing, collecting scores of folk songs in the hills of Kentucky, ascribing his name to such familiar traditional tunes as I Wonder as I Wander. Niles made his first appearance at Gene Thomas's American Folk Song Festival in 1932, calling himself Jack Niles. But in the 1930s, Niles became a popular concert attraction, singing child ballads, spirituals, and his own compositions while recording for the prestigious Victor Red Seal imprint, normally reserved for classical artists of substance. Niles utilized a highly dramatic presence, playing an oversized lute that he designed and built himself, and employing a startling falsetto that captivated his audiences.
Last night she slept in a goose feather bed. Last night she slept with her baby, oh. But tonight she sleeps on the cold, cold ground. But she sleeps with a blackjack gypsy, oh. She sleeps with a blackjack gypsy, oh.
During the Depression, folk music began to change as a left-leaning culture emerged, supporting views of the American Communist Party. Writers such as singer-songwriter Earl Robinson, classical composers Roy Harris and Aaron Copland, and ethnomusicologist Charles Seeger studied traditional folk songs in their work for what was called the Composers Collective. Robinson became especially important to the transition of folk music from traditional to topical, writing folk-oriented radio dramas with politically left-of-center messages, as well as the cantata Ballad for Americans, sung by Paul Robeson. One of the most prominent members of the collective was Elie Siegmeister, a versatile composer and arranger whose talents utilized a wide range of American musical styles, especially folk music. In early 1940, Siegmeister wrote about his fascination with American folk music in an article published in the New York Times, in which he described becoming fascinated with folk music after meeting Aunt Molly Jackson. In 1939, Siegmeister formed the American Ballad Singers, a mixed-gender sextet that toured the U.S., singing Siegmeister's formalized arrangements of American folk songs. Instead of conducting field work, Siegmeister got his material from the Library of Congress, where he pored over thousands of songs dating back to the days of the Pilgrims. The Singers' concerts spanned the entire range of American folk music, including cowboy yodels, sea shanties, spirituals, courting songs, work songs, and hillbilly tunes. In February 1940, the Singers performed at New York's Town Hall, singing some of the songs they had recently recorded for a 4-disc album for Victor.
I'm going there to see my mother. She said she'd meet me when I come. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home.
By the late 1930s, John Lomax, now joined by his son Alan, recorded folk music of all kinds throughout their seemingly unending field trips throughout the American landscape, presented in this highly influential anthology. John Lomax's most famous discovery was Hughie Ledbetter, a convicted murderer serving time at Louisiana's Angola State Prison, who went by the name of Leadbelly. Negotiating for Leadbelly's parole, Lomax booked concerts in New York for Leadbelly to perform his endless catalog of folk songs, blues, chain gang, and work songs. The sartorial Leadbelly resisted being displayed wearing his striped prison uniform and eventually was seen in neatly tailored tuxedos. The pro-union leftists in New York included another Lomax discovery, itinerant Oklahoma songwriter Woody Guthrie, who was first recorded by Alan Lomax in 1940. In New York, Guthrie joined up with other left-leaning folk singers, Lee Hayes, Millard Lampell, and Charles Seeger's son Pete, to form the core of the Almanac Singers, who performed for union causes as well as pro-communist gatherings. Along with other up-and-coming singers in the New York folk movement, the Almanac Singers performed concerts and recitals in settings as varied as informal union halls to Manhattan's massive town hall. In this 1941 ad, you can see other staples of the folk movement emerging, including Burl Ives, Tony Craber, and Josh White. After World War II, a patriotic fervor hit the U.S., with films, radio programs, and records promoting the hearths and homes that had been threatened during the war. Elie Siegmeister's 1946 Broadway revue, Sing Out Sweet Land, was a musical revue focusing on America's folk songs and featuring Oklahoma's Broadway star Alfred Drake. The show helped make a star of Burl Ives, who sang several songs that he soon became identified with, including an old song from minstrelsy that became one of the cornerstones of the folk music revival. Just as Green Grow the Lilacs had done 15 years before, folk music was once again on Broadway.
They lay him under a simmon tree. His epitaph is there to see. Beneath this stone I'm forced to lie, victim of a blue-tailed fly.
Jimmy crack corn and I don't care. Jimmy crack corn and I don't care. Jimmy crack corn and I don't care. My master's gone away.
Sing Out Sweet Land and other productions like Earl Robinson's Ballad for Americans helped fuel the folk music revival, with patriotic themed shows and concerts celebrating American history presented in such formal locales as Town Hall and Carnegie Hall. At the age of 19, raven-haired Susan Reed got her start performing with Burl Ives before emerging as a star on her own, singing Native American ballads and becoming a popular nightclub act at Barney Josephson's Cafe Society in Greenwich Village. After only 1 year, Reed became the first female star of the folk revival, making regular appearances on stage and on radio, performing for the benefit of the armed forces.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, our guest star. In her work in motion pictures, in personal appearances, in recordings and radio, to say nothing of literally hundreds of appearances before the men of our armed forces, she's already had as varied a career as many stars twice her age, for she's just 20 years old. It's a real pleasure to introduce her to you now, Miss Susan Reed.
I'd like to sing a song with a little story in it. I'm sure that a great many of our listeners will remember it. It's called The Soldier and the Lady.
And which one of these odd instruments of yours will you use as your accompaniment?
This is a zither.
Fine, I'll make the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Susan Reed and her zither presenting The Soldier and the Lady.
Soldier, soldier, will you marry me now? Oh, the pipe and the drum. How can I marry such a pretty little girl when I have no coat to put on? When I have no coat to put on.
Also popular in the 1940s was Richard Dyer-Bennet, an English-born, self-described minstrel who helped bring rural English ballads and American folk songs to major New York concert stages. Dyer-Bennet's repertoire of some 600 songs date back to long-forgotten items from the 13th century, sung in a clear, high lyric tenor.
Black is the color of my true love's hair. Her lips are something wondrous fair. The purest eyes the daintiest hands. I love the ground whereon she
Born in Alabama, Frank Warner studied folklore at Duke University in North Carolina before moving to New York. His base for musical field trips he conducted with his wife Anne, bringing back folk songs from his expeditions, which he performed in concert with other expatriates from the Almanac Singers on his first album recorded for Moses Ash's disc label in 1946. These sides show the coalescing of the sound that would later typify records by the Weavers, the Kingston Trio, and countless other groups that formed during the folk music revival.
All the gals are in the police gazette, the crew is all in jail. I'm the only living sea cook's son that's left to tell this tale. Oh, the eve was rising, the gin was getting low, and scarce I think we'll get a drink until we get to Buffalo. Oh, till we get to Buffalo.
Which brings us to the Weavers. The success of New York concert artists such as Richard Dyer-Bennet, Susan Reed, Frank Warner, Josh White, and the Almanac Singers triggered the folk music revival, culminating with the rise of the Weavers in 1949 with their recording of the Hammer Song, a key anthem of the revival. Thank you for your attention. We'll close out with the closing chorus of this immortal record. Whoops. I will find it again and we will play it. Or not. There he goes. Here we go. Can't do without.
Well, I got a hammer, and I got a bell, and I got a song all over this land. It's the hammer of justice, it's the bell of freedom, it's the song about love to free all of my brothers all over this land.
Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you, Carrie. We're going to switch out real quick. Is there a question for Carrie while we're switching out computers here? We just got time for maybe one or two questions.
Carrie,
Yes.
Carrie, I wonder if you could say something about how Libby Holman fits into all this, who she recorded with Josh White, sang blues in the 30s.
This was part of New York's attempt to combine folk music with concert music, opera singers, any kind of formalized setting. The two were a natural combination. They didn't record very much, but that's a great example of the combining of these traditions to appeal to urban audiences. Very important. Anybody else? Yes?
The guitar with two sets of strings and two heads, I have not seen one like that.
The John Jacob Niles instrument, he built by himself.
Wow.
It's kind of based on a lute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Just for the record, Carrie, and you may know that, no pun intended, Swing Out, Sweet Land, is that, we're okay, is being reissued on CD this week, actually.
Oh, great.
By a place in England. Thanks.
Don't worry about your power, because we're